I am honored and excited to be welcoming my guest today, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. He is with me from Columbus, Ohio, and I'm kind of thinking of him as the doctor of disaster avoidance. He has the most appropriate background for the timeliness of what we're all living through today, with him being a neuroscientist, a behavioral economist, a professor, and a best-selling author. So under the topic of mind on this Mind, Money, Motion podcast, Dr. Tsipursky, I'll refer to him as Gleb, is really looking at what are the risks associated with going with our gut. And in fact, that's the name of his most recent book, one of his most recent books, Go With Your Gut. And so we'll talk more specifically about that, and he can share so much more of his background as we walk through some of these questions. My first thought when I connected with you was how perfect your background was, your past experiences, your professional background, for you to basically have become an expert on decision making, and now specifically on disaster avoidance, and more specifically for businesses. So if you can tell us a little bit more about your background, that would be great.
Happy to, Mary, and thank you so much for inviting me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be on. So, my background. Well, I actually became interested in decision making and gut reactions as a kid. Now, my parents, as pretty much everyone, just says, go with your gut, trust your intuitions, follow your instincts. That is the typical advice you get in business and in life on how to live your life and make the right decisions. Unfortunately, their guts often disagreed with each other. So, for example, my mom liked to buy nice clothing, so she'd go out and buy a $100 sweater. And my dad was kind of a cheapskate, so she'd come home and he'd yell at her that no sweater should be worth over $20. And then they'd go at it, bringing up past hurts, getting into a large fight. And so that already impacted me as a kid. As you can imagine, seeing my parents do that, already as a kid, I saw that was kind of pretty dumb. It wasn't helping anyone. It wasn't changing their behavior. My mom kept buying clothing. My dad kept criticizing her. And, it made me realize that nobody sat me down as a kid and said, hey, kiddo, here's how you make good decisions and here's how you should not make decisions. I wasn't taught that in high school. I wasn't taught that in college. That's not taught in business school. I came of age. I was born in 1981, so I came of age around the dot-com boom when the tech companies were partying like it's 1999 and 1999, for those who remember that old Prince song. Maybe that ages me. But just a couple of years later, 2001, 2002, there was the dot-com bust when all of the companies, all the tech leaders who were the heroes in the front pages of the Wall Street Journal in 1999 were now the zeros in 2001, 2002. And even worse, that was not malicious decision-making. That was inadvertent, kind of dumb decision-making that caused people to lose a lot of money. Even worse was the malicious decision-making of Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, the Arthur Andersen, the Bernie Ebbers of the world, who used financial machinations to hide their losses from the dot-com bust. And of course, that led to the implosion of companies like Enron and so on. A lot of companies lost a great deal of money. People lost their life savings. That was pretty terrible. So that helped me realize that even the titans of industry, the ones who are praised as the best decision makers of us all, sometimes make terrible mistakes, often accidentally, sometimes maliciously. And that helped me realize that, hey, this is something that I can help address, study decision making. So I decided to go into decision making that was a turning point in my life. And so I went into studying how do we make decisions? How do we make decisions badly? How can we make decisions better? And as I began to study this topic, of course, people began to ask me about it. So that's how I became a coach. Then I became a consultant, then trainer, speaker on these topics. And over time, I realized that there's pretty little quality information available in the mainstream literature, in the public domain, on how to make good decisions. So I had to go into academia, and I spent 15 years in academia doing cognitive neuroscience, which is the study of how our brain function and aspects cause us to engage in certain behaviors. And then I was also doing behavioral economics, which specifically studies how we as human beings behave in economic settings. And so at the same time, I was moonlighting as a consultant, coach, and trainer. So my experience of doing consulting, coaching, and training in business settings has been over 20 years. And in academia has been 15 years or so. So all of that is brought together in my newest book, as Marie pointed out, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And that's what I help do. And unfortunately, in our troubled times right now with COVID-19, I have way too much business that I wish I didn't have.
So when you say never go with your gut, I know a little bit about how the brain works, which is surprising, but it really helps to understand that. And maybe that's something we should just start with our listeners to kind of recap how the brain works, and which is why then you advise never go with your gut.
That's right. So our brain is composed of a number of feeling systems, thinking systems, mental processes, and the one associated with our gut reactions, that's our emotions, that's our intuitions. It's incredibly powerful. It determines 80 to 90% of what we think, how we behave. Unfortunately, that very powerful part of us, the part that causes us to feel very comfortable and then do what feels comfortable and believe what feels like it's comfortable to believe, is not adapted for the modern world. It's simply not. It's adapted. It's the part of the older part of our brain, the autopilot system, which is adapted for the savanna environment. When we were hunters and gatherers, living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, surviving by foraging, hunting, and so on. And so we had to have I'll just name two elements of that time that were very problematic for us right now. One is tribalism. So it was very important for us to be tribal, to look for people who are like us, to value them, to have the same beliefs that they do, and of course dislike people who don't, in order to survive in that environment. If we weren't sufficiently loyal to the tribe, we'd be kicked out of the tribe and we'd die. Or the tribe, if everyone wasn't sufficiently loyal in that tribe, it would fall apart and then everyone would die. And we are the descendants of those people who didn't die. So we are very tribal. That's one aspect. The other aspect I want to highlight is called the fight or flight response. Now you might have heard of this. It's where you jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger, also called the saber-toothed tiger response. Now that was critical in the savanna environment when threats were immediate, intense, and in the moment. Right now, however, we have many less saber-toothed tigers, you might notice, but we still respond to things like, let's say, a client sending a constructive critical email like it's a saber-toothed tiger. So we are tempted, very strongly tempted with our intuitions, gut reactions, to either ignore the email, delete it, pretend it never happened. That's the flight response, Or the other response is to write back and say, what are you talking about? I'm right, you're wrong, you're a jerk, I'm awesome. That's the fight response. Neither of those is helpful for client retention, as you hopefully have figured out if you are working with clients. What you need to do is figure out, hey, what's going on here? Well, what is causing the client to make that statement? And if one client is saying that, writing that irate email, there's probably 100 of them who are thinking that. Recently, I had a client write to me about a workbook issue based on workbooks that I saw on my website, disasteravoidanceexperts.com, wrote to me that, hey, there's some graphic issues with the workbook, and then I had to go out and figure out, well, what's the process, what's the system that failed in my systems and processes that led to some graphic issues, design of the workbook being completely off. So I eventually figured it out. But what you have to do for yourself is figure out what's causing your client to be irate, what in your systems and processes is leading to this bad outcome, and you need to fix that. You need to figure out and fix that, of course. So it's good that they're giving you that information. And then you have to, of course, calm the client. I mean, I gave the client a free workbook as a way of addressing the situation. Fair enough. And that you have to figure out some way of calming the client, addressing the situation effectively. So that's one aspect of fight or flight response, that we have to face a lot of minor everyday threats to which we respond badly when we go with our intuitions. The other aspect of fight or flight, which causes us to respond really badly, is things like COVID-19, a slow-moving train wreck like the pandemic. Now, there are plenty of people who respond with the flight response, which means ignoring the information about the pandemic, just going about their everyday life and saying, hey, this is nothing, it'll blow over, it's an exaggeration, whatever, that it's not going to happen. it's not going to touch me. There's a whole bunch of people who did that, and you could see that. I mean, the funniest thing and the most sad thing from business setting was when Hobby Lobby, the store, arts and crafts store, was arguing that it's an essential business. I somehow don't see arts and crafts as an essential business in this environment. And of course, that really hurt its reputation. Now, think about it. This is a national chain store, and this is retail, which is really already down. Do they need the damage to their reputation from being singled out in the newspapers as the dumb business that didn't close? No. But here's the clear example of where they had a very strong flight response. Fight response, of course, is more of the panic shopping that you see, panic buying, and whether toilet paper or guns, which have been also apparently, as I found out, have been widely sold, huge spike in gun sales. That's for ordinary people. You have the same sort of things going on in businesses where there's a fight response and they're going to their emergency plans and they're implementing their emergency plans, not realizing that a slow-moving train wreck is not an emergency. That's not what we're facing. We're facing a new normal, a major disruption that changed our environment and we're not going to be out of it until we find a vaccine and distribute it and vaccinate people, which at the most optimistic scenario will be 2 years, more realistically closer to 5 years perhaps, and pessimistically never, because we'd never found a good vaccine for the flu, so it's possible we'll not find one for COVID-19. But at least 2 years of the situation of loosening and tightening of various restrictions. That's not a time for your emergency plan. That's a time to fundamentally change your business model and pivot to the new normal. And I see very few people doing that. And that's all the fact that we respond badly when we go with our gut intuitions.
So what I'm hearing you say is just by the nature of our brain physiology, the deck is stacked against us from the standpoint of our automatic autopilot system kicks in for 80 to 90 plus of our decisions. So how does a business owner kick themselves out of that side of the brain and try to move forward for COVID-19, for example, related decisions to move forward positively?
The first thing to realize is that our brain is flawed. If we don't have that awareness, that we're not really going to make good decisions, and realize how it's flawed. The specific flaws that are part of our decision-making processes that cause our decision-making processes to go wrong are called cognitive biases. So cognitive biases are these decision-making errors. And these are the things that you have to learn and realize that there's over 100 of them. You can take a look at the list of Wikipedia of cognitive biases. You'll see all the research behind them. That's what the list in Wikipedia is about. It's about the cognitive biases, the research, the studies, and so on. Now, my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, talks about the 30 most dangerous in business settings, and doesn't talk about the research on them in depth, it cites it, but what it talks about is the specific case studies of how business leaders can address and avoid them. So pragmatic, real world case studies from my experience. So you need to learn about these things. Now, the ones most applicable to COVID-19, they're going to be three. One is called the normalcy bias. That refers to the fact that when we imagine the future, when we think about the future, we feel that the future in the medium term, next few years, will be mostly like the past. Maybe a little bit of changes, whatever. Amazon gaining more dominance, more smartphone use, but it's going to be mainly like the past. So it feels very uncomfortable to accept the fact that we now have a very different future with COVID-19 around for at least the next 2 years. And think about the fact that even in the most optimistic scenario, in the next 2 years, if people spend a lot of that time shut into their homes, doing social distancing, that's going to change a lot of habits and a lot of patterns of behavior. And of course, the economic recession is going to change a lot of habits and patterns of behavior. So it's not like things will magically go back to the state of January 2020, in January 22, when hopefully we'll find a vaccine. And of course, it might be more like 5 years. That's quite likely, actually. It's more likely that it's going to be 2 years, because 2 years is a very, very optimistic scenario. So it's not going to magically happen. That means that you need to accept that you're in a different new normal and you will be in that state, and it's very uncomfortable to accept that. So that's the first thing that you need to deal with. That's the one that you need to think about, the normalcy bias. Another one you have to think about is called the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy refers to the fact that we are very confident about our plans. We like ourselves. We think we're good people. We think we make good plans, and businesses especially, when they make their strategic plans, they go forward and they stick to them, and they don't think about all the problems, all the issues, all the risks that would undermine the plans. And they're like COVID-19 or a whole range of other things. COVID-19 in America is one example. Of course, COVID-19 started in China, and that disrupted a whole range of supply chains, including for some manufacturing clients of mine. And they weren't really thinking about the disruption to their supply chains. Fortunately, they had plans in place for addressing supply chain disruptions. Most don't. Most businesses don't have a good plan in case of disruptions to supply chains. So you need to make sure that you integrate risks and problems into your plans. Most people don't. That's the planning fallacy. And so the normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, the last one you want to think about in terms of COVID-19 is called hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting refers to us discounting the value of the long-term future and focusing on short-term gains. So we overvalue short-term gains at the cost of long-term rewards. That is a huge problem for us, because, of course, the long-term rewards and the long-term situation in general is going to be severely impacted by COVID-19. There are a lot of people right now who think that, who are using hope as a strategy. Hey, government will support us, and then COVID-19 will blow over in a few months. That hope is not a strategy. You got to realize that hope is not a strategy, and that is a completely unrealistic perspective that it will blow over in a few months. If you look at what the best health experts are saying, I'm an expert in disaster avoidance, risk management, and decision making, so I'm not a health expert. But what I do is I look at what the experts are saying and then base my decisions based on experts in any field, and that's what you should be doing. Look at the experts and what they're saying, and they're saying, early 2022 is the earliest we can possibly have a realistic chance of getting to beyond COVID-19. So in that case, you want to orient toward that timeline. So these three cognitive biases should cause you to understand that, hey, there's going to be risk management issues in how you go forward, and you do not want that risk exposure for yourself. So what you need to do in order to move beyond COVID-19 in a positive way is figure out how to fundamentally transform your business model in order to adapt and survive and thrive in the new normal. Transforming your business model means, well, I'll just give a couple of examples. It means thinking about your internal business model as well as your external business model. Your internal business model, you're probably going to be moving to virtual teams, and you're not simply going to come back to the office in a couple of months, as many people are thinking. You're going to be staying in virtual teams because we will have waves of loosening and then more outbreaks and restrictions. That's what happened in countries that successfully controlled their initial outbreaks, like Singapore, like Japan. They had successful initial control, which is not what the US had. We do not have successful initial control. We're trying to get there, and it will take for a while until we get there. But then once they had successful initial control, Singapore, Japan, and so on, and they loosened restrictions, they had more outbreaks. And that's what will definitely happen in the US. There's no way that it will not happen. So given that, there will be another wave of restrictions coming down. And that's what will happen for the next 2 to 5 years. So you need to prepare for that and plan for that. And you should keep your team virtual. You shouldn't send your team back to the office because you don't want to be doing yo-yoing. Because that's what a lot of businesses will be doing, yo-yoing to office, office, home. You do not want that disruption for your team. So you need to make your team virtual. And in order to make your team virtual, you need to think about a whole range of issues. One is motivation and engagement. We already have a plague of disengagement in the US. Only 34% of workers are fully engaged, according to Gallup studies on this topic. And of course, they will be more disengaged when they're at home because they're not surrounded by people in their office. They're not surrounded by their objects in their office that remind them to work. So you need to figure out how to motivate them and engage them while they're at home. That's one. Second, you need to teach them how to communicate effectively in virtual settings. Most people don't know how to do this well. I mean, it's hard enough to communicate in real settings, in normal settings. And of course, in virtual settings, it's much harder because you're not face to face. A lot of people just use text, and then text, you can't read emotional undertones. Even in, let's say, when you're doing video phones, of course, you can read tone, but you can't read body language. When you're doing video conference, you see each other as a whole bunch of small squares in a large square. So it's pretty hard to read body language in that case. So you're not getting a lot of the communication, what people actually mean when they say whatever they say. And that is something you need to train your people in. Now, another thing you need to train people in is problem noticing and problem solving and conflict resolution. Because right now, well, in the office environment, people notice problems and solve problems pretty easily when they run into each other in the hallway and they say, hey, Mary, well, what about this thing this project that we're working on? How can we quickly solve this issue? And then they chat for a few minutes and they resolve it. So they notice problems and they solve them pretty quickly. And they resolve conflicts face to face. It's much easier to do than doing that virtually. You will find that many more problems are cropping up because they're not being noticed and nipped in the bud. And there's much more trouble that people have resolving conflicts when they're not face to face. So you need to figure that out. The next thing you need to figure out is accountability. Now, people are used to being accountable when they're in the office because they know that their supervisor can just walk around the office, see what's going on, see who's working or not, all of that stuff, and just check in with them. You're not going to be able to do that anymore. So you need to figure out how to hold people accountable effectively. And you need to think about issues of security, especially information security. A lot more people are hacking, are trying to hack because they know that a lot more people are working virtually and they're not used to working virtually. So they're making a whole lot more mistakes. The FBI has been reporting there is a lot more hacking going on. So you need to ensure that people have more security. And last but not least, this is perhaps the most important thing, is how will you make sure that people cultivate relationships and build trust with each other? Now, right now, or in the office environment, not right now, in the office environment, that took place just by people talking over the water cooler about their kids, about their vacation plans, about the local sports ball team and how much they hate the sports ball team next town over, all of that stuff. And having lunch with each other. That helped them know each other as human beings, humanize them, connect them, build that bond of trust and relationships. And of course, they're not going to be able to do that right now. So you need to figure out how to replace that. One way to do that, now my team, Disaster Avoidance Experts, it's a boutique consulting, coaching, and training company in disaster avoidance, risk management, decision making. We are in all virtual teams, and we were before the crisis. So what we do is we have a virtual water cooler where each day in our Trello board, on a board, everyone shares how they're feeling, how they're doing, what's up in their life, what's new and interesting that people in the team don't know about them, and what's going on in their work. And then they share all that. So it just takes about 10 minutes maybe. They share that and then they respond to 3 other people who shared that. So that way you keep a constant engagement and building relationships with each other, learning about each other, humanizing each other, reminding each other that everyone's a human being. That's really helpful. And that's something I helped establish for a number of clients, whether in Slack, whether in whatever collaboration software. So these are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about in order to successfully survive and thrive in this pandemic for your internal business model. You also want to be thinking about your external business model. Now that's going to be much more dependent on what kind of business that you're engaged in, but you want to make sure that you can deliver your services virtually, and then that you can cultivate relationships with your vendors, with your clients, with your service providers, with your investors, with your legislators if you're involved in that, with your civic leaders, other community stakeholders. You need to cultivate those relationships in a virtual setting, and you need to figure out how to do that effectively. So the virtual transformation will really depend on the kind of business that you're in, but the cultivation of relationships will need to take place, and you need to figure out how to do that. So those are the kinds of things that business leaders can use to move forward effectively. And of course, they need to throw out their old strategic plan and figure out a new strategic plan for this new reality of the next 5 years. Well, the new reality might be 2 years to 5 years, but you want to not prepare for the most optimistic scenario because that's kind of dumb. You want to make sure that you're prepared for a realistic pessimistic scenario So prepare for 5 years, just in case. It'll be great if it's 2 years, but you want to be prepared for 5 years. So make a strategic plan for that period and make sure that you're prepared to survive and thrive in that environment. And also make sure that you're prepared to take advantage of any competitors who are in the wishful thinking mode, super optimistic mode, unrealistic optimists, and actually don't prepare well for this new environment, and who will then be hobbled, and some will go bankrupt. And you need to be prepared to seize market share from them. So collaborate with their clients. How will you make sure to service their clients effectively and take over their clients? That's one. And second, how will you help take resources as they perhaps lay off some employees, some really good employees, perhaps sell some inventory, sell some material resources. So think about that. How will you outcompete the competition?
Wow, there's so much there. Your book is chock full of that. I love the deep dive into the 30 different cognitive biases, even though there's 100 plus, and you only touched on a few, but so many action items there. Your book also has a fantastic 8-step decision-making model for business leaders and individuals, even to be thinking about all the things to think about in making a wise decision. And one other term I wanted to ask you about that's also in your book is called mental fitness. What is that?
Right now, you're probably practicing physical fitness. And physical fitness is actually pretty hard to practice, partially because our gut intuitions go against it. When you see a box of dozen donuts, it's very tempting to eat that whole box of dozen donuts, because in the savanna environment, when you came across a source of sugar, a source of honey, a source of apples, so anything like that, it was very beneficial for your survival to eat the whole thing. That was very good for you, and that's who survived. So we're the descendants of those people who stuffed their faces with all the sugar they can find. Unfortunately, right now, that instinct serves you wrong. When you see a box of dozen donuts in the break room, one is okay, maybe two, but you gotta stop at the third donut. Well, unfortunately, it's very hard to stop at the third donut because of that intuition, that gut reaction. Hopefully by now you have learned how to stop at that second donut, how to not eat more than 2 donuts, or 1 donut ideally. Unfortunately, some people have not. That's why we have the obesity epidemic here in this country. But that's all coming from your gut reactions, and we kind of know that that's a bad thing for us, that that's not healthy for us. So that's the physical fitness. Unfortunately, very many people do not know that it's not healthy for their mental fitness to go with their gut reactions on decision making. Your mental fitness is about developing the kind of habits that you've developed for physical fitness. Not eating the right food, not eating the wrong food, going to the exercise, going to do some exercises, probably not at the gym right now, but maybe using some dumbbells downstairs, doing some yoga. All of those sorts of things are hard to develop, they're uncomfortable, but you need to do it for the sake of your physical body. Well, your mind is just as or even more important than the rest of your body for your success in the modern world. But we're not working out our mind. We're just going with our gut intuitions. It's just like, whenever you see a box of dozen donuts, you eat the box of dozen donuts and you just, veg out and sit on the couch and watch Netflix all day. That's the equivalent of, in physical fitness, of just going with your gut on decision making. And it's just as bad for you. It's just as bad for your mind. It undermines your ability to make good decisions, really harms you, and causes you to make really bad decisions going forward when you have not trained yourself to notice and address these dangerous judgment errors, these cognitive biases which come from our gut intuitions. And you have not trained yourself to adopt the healthy mental habits of noticing these things and addressing them. In my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, I talk about the mental habits that you can develop to address each individual cognitive bias, as well as the strategies to address a number of them at once, like the 8-step strategy that Marie described for how you should make major decisions in business settings or individual settings that you don't want to screw up and you want to make as good as possible.
Thank you. You have so much to offer and such good advice. I think our listeners would be so well served to be diving into your book and even acting on just a few of the items. They'd be so much further ahead. If you had to nutshell just a little piece of what we talked about today in hopes that our listeners would leave not forgetting at least 3 things, what would those 3 things be?
I think the most important thing right now in the current environment with COVID-19 are the free cognitive biases I described about COVID-19 in particular. The normalcy bias, where we tend to feel very much that the world will be normal, even when we have suffered a major disruption and the world will very much not be normal. That's one. Second one is planning fallacy, where we tend to make plans, assume that they will go right, and not pivot in a nearly timely enough manner when they don't go right, and not build in risks and contingencies into these plans. And finally, hyperbolic discounting, where we tend to be way too short-term oriented and not think nearly enough about the long-term consequences of our actions and decisions. So if you can address these three things, I believe that you'll be much better off than so many other people who will be making bad decisions in this current pandemic context.
Great advice. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your research, your work, get information about your book, and connect with you as well?
My book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, is available in bookstores everywhere. It's published by a great traditional publisher called Career Press. Well, the bookstores might be closed around you, so you can check it out, of course, online on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, on Audible, so there's an audiobook available, or of course, physical copy, digital copy on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so on. My own resources are on disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com. You especially want to check out a free 8-video based class on making the wisest decisions on disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And finally, I'm very active on LinkedIn, so if you have any questions about anything you've heard on this podcast, please connect with me there. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, Gleb Tsipursky.
Thank you so much, Gleb. This was very enlightening and a helpful conversation, and I appreciate you sharing your passion and all of the excellent advice.
Thank you so much, Marie. It's been a pleasure.